So thank you for being here this morning and welcome. And this, as I said in the prayer, is the second week of our series, Peace of Mind, Faith and Mental Health. And what we're doing in this series is we are exploring a topic in which the relationship of religious people to this topic has been strained over time, the relationship between faith and mental health. So many people, maybe you're one of them, have sought Christian counseling or talked to a pastor, and maybe you were dealing with something that may have even been diagnosable by a mental health professional, and maybe you went to this person, open and seeking answers, and maybe you heard something like, well, you just need to pray more, or you just need to have more faith, and those answers sounded good to the people who were giving them to you. They were well-meaning people probably, but you could probably tell that the answer really wasn't adequate to address what you were experiencing. And we know now, living in the post-enlightenment era, in the scientific age, that those of us who believe that God is a creator in some way, that God has also created us with brains and the ability to do medical research and the ability to invent medications or discover medications and be able to think about counseling and how our minds work. And we realize even, the biblical Greek word in the New Testament for the soul is psyche in Greek, where we get our word psyche. And the Bible doesn't use a phrase like mental health, but it speaks about our souls and our well-being and our peace. And so Scripture actually has a lot to say about this topic, of course, written in a different time. And so we're looking at how we as thinking, compassionate people can integrate our faith with the best of healthcare and medical science and mental healthcare. And so one of our own is going to help us do that well today. Usually I save the expert for the end of the series, but we needed to call in help early on in this series. So I've invited one of our own here, Carrie Wester, who is a chaplain and a manager of spiritual care here locally in the Valley, to speak to us and help us just to lay the foundation, because frankly, a lot of us raised in religious environments, this is so skewed for us, we're not really sure even how to define the terms. And so Carrie's going to be speaking to us today about what mental health is, what mental illness is, and help us to start to integrate our faith with medical science. And so what I'm going to do here is read Carrie's bio and then welcome her up, and she's going to speak to us today. And I have to confess, reading Carrie's bio, I think, makes me question my own self-esteem. She has 2 master's degrees. And so I think, wow, she is quite accomplished. But I'm going to read her bio and then welcome Carrie. All right, Carrie Wester currently serves as the manager of spiritual care for Dignity Health's East Valley Hospitals, where she oversees a team of 12 chaplains in 3 locations. During nearly 20 years of experience in healthcare, Carrie has served as a staff chaplain at Banner Behavior Health in Scottsdale, where she was the sole chaplain for patients with mental illness. Prior to that, Carrie was a member of the chaplaincy team at Seton Healthcare Family in Austin, Texas, and a volunteer chaplain at Kossuth Regional Hospital Hospice of the Heartland in Iowa. Carrie has a wide range of clinical skills that include spiritual and emotional support, grief support, ministry in crises, spiritual group leadership, and the development of spiritual services and events. Carrie was an officer in the United States Air Force, 355th Medical Group at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona. After that time, she worked for the Southern Arizona Veterans Affairs healthcare system. She also served as a professor for Ottawa University, where she instructed healthcare administration classes on leadership, cultural diversity, compliance, and regulations. Carrie earned a Master of Divinity from Fuller Theological Seminary and a Master of Business Administration from the University of Colorado. You see what I mean when I read her bio? We're so happy and proud, Carrie, that you're part of our congregation, and happy to have you with us. Let's welcome Carrie Wester. Come on up, Carrie.
Well, hello, everyone. So when Ryan asked me to do this, I told him, I said, I'm a little more of a teacher than a preacher. So I'm going to go through the presentation, and then you guys will have a little time to ask me questions if you like, okay? And then we'll close out from there. So connections, maintaining your faith while struggling with mental illness. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. As my bio said, I worked at Banner Behavioral Health. The majority of my time as a staff chaplain was in the area of behavioral health. And I have a strong passion for this area, even though I'm not technically working in the behavioral health setting. I'm trying to create training for chaplains to interact better with behavioral health patients, because in the medical setting we have behavioral health patients too, and just teach people how we can help in these different areas as a chaplain. Now, so a chaplain, what does a chaplain do exactly? A chaplain is trained to be, at least a hospital chaplain, trained to be in the clinical setting. So it is not a job where we go in and try to promote our own faith. We have to be solid in our own faith, but we're not promoting our own faith. We are there as a guide to the people in their own journey. So we listen, a lot of it is listening, and then maybe presenting some things we've heard them say to kind of guide them on the right path. So some people, there are chaplains of all different faiths, Jewish, Muslim. I have a Muslim chaplain on my staff now. So there's sometimes a misconception that it's all Christian and they're there to pastor people. It's a different role than a pastor. Okay? Well, let's get to the outline here. What I'm going to go through is we're going to talk about mental illness in general. Then we're going to talk about the effects of mental illness on individuals and how the view of God affects someone when they're struggling with mental illness. And then we're going to go through several methods of how to maintain your connection to your faith if you are struggling with a mental illness. Maybe it's not you that's struggling. Maybe you know someone else that's struggling, and maybe some of this information you can use to support them. Okay? And then I'll leave some time for questions, okay? All right. So first, let's talk about the statistics. Yes. So I'm focusing on adults today. There are different statistics for adolescents and children, but today we're going to focus on adults. In the United States, these are United States statistics, 1 in 5 experience a mental health condition every year. That's quite a high percentage, 20%. And of those who experience this, we're going to get into the diagnoses in a minute, but the highest diagnosis amount is for anxiety disorders. So there's general anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, panic attack type things. 1 in 20 lives with a serious mental illness. They're using the examples of schizophrenia and bipolar as some of those serious mental illnesses. And 1 in 15 experience both a mental health disorder and substance abuse. And if you think about that, that makes a lot of sense, because if you are struggling with a mental illness and don't realize that's what it is, and you have the pain of the mental illness, sometimes people will try to self-medicate and then become addicted to something. 12 plus million had serious thoughts of suicide in their life. 12 plus million in the United States have seriously thought about suicide at some time. This is a huge number, and really suicide in our country is at epidemic proportions practically. We are, as a wealthy nation, comparing to other wealthy nations, we have the highest rate of suicide. We are double the rate of suicide to the United Kingdom. So think about that. And we know that it's increased, as the next bullet says. We know that from 1999 till today, it has increased 35%. So we got to ask ourselves why that is and what we can do to help prevent that more. That's one of the things that in my new role I've been trying to promote suicide prevention, and did a campaign in September for Suicide Prevention Month. So if you want more information about that, please, I'll stick around a little bit and you can talk to me about that as well. Half of mental illnesses appear by the time someone is 14, and 75% by the time they're 24. So the thing about the age 14, we all know that that is a turbulent age already, right? Going into the teenage years, body's changing, hormones changing, peer pressure is on. And so sometimes you see a shift already in your teenager because of all those things. But because of that, sometimes that change, the kind of normal transition, masks what might be a mental illness in the background. So I just tell folks, teenagers, just keep a good eye on them. And if you suspect anything, just talk and see, okay? All right. So we're going to go through diagnoses, definitions, just to help get to what you might see in others or what might be something you struggle with yourself. So could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. As I said before, anxiety disorders are the most prevalent. And so disorder is not just, hey, I'm nervous to get up and speak in front of you today. It is a persistent sense of anxiousness that affects you on a regular basis in your life. Some people, it presents in an interesting way sometimes as like that perfectionistic, everything's done way ahead of time kind of person. And those usually are the ones that go unnoticed because they're so high performers. But in the background is this anxiety. And so anxiety within it can create issues of racing thoughts. It can create an issue of not being able to calm down your body, having those feelings of like, I struggle with general anxiety disorder. So I'll tell you, when I was at the height of my anxiety, I described it as ants running around in my skin and that I couldn't calm down. Like it just felt like ants were in me. Like I like jittery kind of thing all the time. And so I'm doing very well now, but that's how I described it when I was going through it. So bipolar disorder, this used to be called manic depressive. So high highs, low lows. Some folks who are manic depressive, they don't want to go on medications because the manic phases feel euphoric. But during those manic phases, often what happens is people become impulsive. They make bad decisions about money or become promiscuous or something that they later regret. And then they fall into the low lows, very deep depression. So it's kind of this up and down and difficult to deal with, of course. Borderline personality disorder usually comes about because of a trauma, often in childhood. And this is characterized by extremely unstable moods, rocky relationships, attention-seeking type behaviors, probably because they didn't receive the proper attention before in their life. And then depression, I think most of us know the generalities about depression, right? We know that it's a sadness, but it's more than a sadness. It's a lack of enjoyment of life, sometimes leading to a point of not wanting to live anymore. And depression and anxiety actually go closely at hand together. They are often diagnosed together or one then the other because it affects the same chemicals in your brain. They're closely tied. So if you look at a scan of a person with depression that versus a person that is not struggling with depression of their brain and the activity, it shows a stark difference in the amount of activity and what lights up basically in the scan. So this is, as Ryan talked about, this is not just it's not just something we're thinking like, I can just think myself out of this sadness. It goes much deeper. Our brain is an organ like any other organ within our body, right? So if our heart had an illness, we would treat that. Well, sometimes our brain has an illness, and we need to treat that. And they all, body, mind, and spirit, go together, right? So I always say when all three of those are in good balance, that is when we are the healthiest. So, all right, going on to the next. I find that substance abuse is still probably the most stigmatized because people often look at it and say that they think people can just stop. Could you change the slide? That people could just stop. And actually what happens in these cases is that once you become addicted, it is now the illness. Okay, so I had a social worker I worked with at Banner that she would describe it as your brain is a cucumber and then your brain is a pickle. And once it's a pickle, you can't go back to the cucumber. That's how she would describe it. And so, yes, it's preventable. We can prevent it by not starting, but that's really the only way to stop it. And then there's other factors that come into play, right? Our genetics. If we have addictive behaviors that are in our family, that's probably to examine ourselves about what we are doing and when we're doing it and how we're doing it, if we feel that addiction might be something we fall into. And then environment, if you grow up in a household where drugs are prevalent, I met a lot of teenagers that were introduced to drugs by their family. And that's always a sad one. When I worked with both adolescents and adults, and I never got more upset than when I was working with the adolescents whose family or parents were the cause of some of the issues, or were not helping their children when they could have been. So, and then developmental phase. Developmental phase. So, the earlier someone starts with drugs or alcohol, it stunts the developmental phase there. And so sometimes you might meet someone who is struggling with alcohol or drugs, and they seem a lot younger, a lot less mature than you would expect them. And it's because they probably started young, and it kind of stunted their developmental growth. So all these together, as I said, I think we have to have some grace for people who struggle with addiction. Most of the people I've talked to who are struggling with addiction, they've turned to drugs or alcohol to overcome some pain, whether it be physical or emotional, something that they couldn't find another way to deal with at the time. I don't think it's just 99% of the time, it's not just someone decides. It's that they're trying to help themselves, and that's the way they know how to do it. So, all right, going on. All right. So these are symptoms of diagnoses, but are not actual, diagnoses themselves. Psychosis is characterized as disruptions to a person's thoughts. And this is the most common disease is schizophrenia, to present with hallucinations. And hallucinations can be visual. They can be something someone sees that's not there. It can be something someone hears that's not there. It can even be a sense of someone touching you or something touching you. That would be a tactile hallucination. So those things, or delusions, which would be something like believing people are out to get you, believing something that is not real, is not actually happening. So that's one. Catatonia is, you may have seen movies where they present someone with psychiatric illness and they're just blank and just out of touch and not responding to anything. And that is one way that catatonia presents. The other way that it presents is a repetitive motion that continues over and over again and creates the same trance-like state. So those are the two ways it can present. Self-harm is often used sometimes out of control. There's something that they want to control. Sometimes it's also a relief of there's physical or there's emotional pain, and they want to be distracted from it. They want relief from that, so they cause physical pain instead. So, all right. Going on to suicide. As I said, we really need to talk about suicide. This is a problem. It's a problem in our country, and we need to be comfortable talking about this because we know so many people struggle with these thoughts, these ideas. And we know that 46% of people who die by suicide have already been diagnosed with a mental illness. So we know that this is a factor leading up to suicide. Suicidal thoughts alone are not an emergency, but suicidal behaviors are an emergency. And what I want to point that out because some folks who struggle with mental illness, the idea that suicide is a possibility is always plan B for them sometimes. And it may be they have no intent to go and do it right now, but they might have it in their head that, hey, if this doesn't work, this is always an option, which is a sad state to be in, of course. But if someone does not have a plan or is not, telling you, I'm going to go do this, then they still need help. But if someone says, I'm going home and I'm going to kill myself, that's an emergency, obviously. Take them to the emergency room. They need help. We have a new crisis line nationally for mental illness and mental health, and it's 988. So if you ever are in a situation where you don't know, you don't know if you should take the person in or not, that's a good resource. Call 988 and they'll help walk you through it, okay? And as I said, some people, suicide does feel like an option. And the people I've talked to who are suicidal, they are, it's not that they want to die. It's not. What they're looking for is relief. They want relief from something they haven't been able to find relief from, right? So that's where it is. That's where it comes from. If there was another way of relief that they saw, chances are they would not have those suicidal thoughts. So when someone's struggling with a mental illness, it has a lot of effect on relationships and feeling distant from others. Maybe there's racing thoughts. Maybe there are voices that are getting in the way. Maybe there are depression and they don't want to get out of bed. They don't want to go do anything. And I say want, but truthfully, it is incredibly difficult for someone who is in a major depressive state to make themselves get out of bed and do something. So, one of the things I used to hear is, well, exercise helps with depression. Well, sure it does. But if you can barely get out of bed and brush your teeth, what makes you think the person's going to get up and run around the block? They're not going to do that. We got to take this in steps and get them help first, right? So with that, there might be difficulty in praying. Intrusive thoughts come in, or you just don't find joy in it. You don't find the connection to God in it. And so you just stop. Hallucinations or delusions that are religiously oriented. So I met several people who thought they were God, which is a different kind of distance from God when you think you are. And then you have folks that think they're afflicted with demons. These were common occurrences. And so if you think about that, if you think you're being attacked by demons and God is not helping you, where does your faith go in that? You feel like God is not helping you, People would ask me if I believed in demons and angels and spiritual beings, and I do. I believe in that. But I also believe in mental illness. And so when I would talk to these people that had religious preoccupations, is what they would call it, I would tell them, we're going to pray about both. We're going to pray about your spiritual health and your physical health, and encourage them to get the help they needed with their treatment as well. And then, as I said before, if you look at two different brains on a scan, you can see the differences. Your brain is an organ like any other. And so your brain is affected when there's a chemical imbalance, sometimes hormones, sometimes a traumatic event occurs, and you are impacted by that, and it impacts your brain. So next, something that helps people who are struggling with mental illness are their religious beliefs, but the idea is that God is loving and caring and helping. If you have that view of God, that's a good space to be in. But some people don't have that view of God. They have a view of God that is rule-based and punitive and wrathful. If that is a view of God that a person has as they're struggling with mental illness, it often means that they're worse off, not better off. They think maybe God is creating it, maybe God is causing it. And that is, of course, not true. But that can create negative effects on someone, and you could understand why, right? It leads to guilt and shame and what am I doing wrong? So if you happen to have that still in your mind somewhere, that God is punitive and wrathful and punishing of you, I just would say really examine your view of God. our Bible tells us that God is love, and I believe that. God is love. So we can be stigmatized in different religious organizations, folks struggling with mental health, and I have heard people come in, patients come in and even say, I shouldn't be here. I should have just trusted God. I wasn't trusting God enough. And which I always thought, God places people in our lives to help us. God places good, smart people on this earth to study things like psychiatry and psychology and counseling, like Ryan has said. And it's true. God is in each one of us. We have a spark of divinity, and we can be helpful and united with one another in these efforts. God did not mean us to do life alone, and so he gives us each other to do that. And so sometimes religious people who are struggling with something like depression think, I have everything. I'm very blessed. Why do I feel depressed? Well, because you have a clinical illness that is causing you to feel depressed. Or anxiety, sometimes people think, why am I fearful? God has told me so many times not to be fearful, and I'm fearful. Well, once again, it's a clinical illness that someone's struggling with. So it's not that your faith is in crisis, it's that you have an illness. And so I'm going to reiterate the last bullet is that if you are holding on to a view of God that is punitive, I would examine, that and really, really think about how you view God. So going on to the connection methods that I'm going to talk about. So gratitude is the first one. Gratitude is it's a method that helps people, whether you have mental illness or not, gratitude helps. And there's studies out there now about how gratitude helps, whether it be physically, mentally, etc. And so here's a few different ways to do it. There's an article in little bitty writing there. Oh, not so little bitty. But that article talked about a study where they had people write thank you cards to people that impacted their life greatly. And they learned that over time, the effects of it, the beneficial effects of it went up, as opposed to like if someone's taking a medication and then they stop, kind of goes like that, it takes a nosedive. But if they're practicing gratitude and even if they stop, it seemed to have increasingly beneficial effects. So that's one method if you wanted to try to start, writing thank you letters for people that impacted you. It doesn't matter to if you send them or not. It's just the idea that you're thinking in a grateful way. You can keep a gratitude journal. You can do, 1 a day, 3 a day, 10 a day, whatever works for you. That is another way to kind of hone into your gratitude. Share things with your friends and families that you are grateful for. And this has actually shown that when you share the good stuff with each other, it creates a stronger bond than when you talk about the negative stuff, right? Now, all of us sometimes need a time to vent, to get stuff out. And that's fine. But this is saying when you share the good stuff in your life, when you share the things that you are grateful for, that is more beneficial to the bond between people, which is kind of neat. So think of past times. Maybe you're in a state where it's hard to be grateful. A lot is going on. Think of things in the past that have been something you've been grateful for, a moment, a memory, and we're going to talk about that a little more too. Or just say thank you more often. Sometimes I don't write down my gratitude, but I'll be walking through, walking around a building and there's bushes and there's beautiful purple flowers. Well, that is something in my mind to be grateful for, the beauty of nature. Right? So those are some ways to practice gratitude. Prayer and meditation. Now, this study actually says your physical brain can be changed by regular practice of prayer and meditation, thickening of the cortex to protect against things like depression, which is, once again, just incredible. We are connected, mind, body, and spirit. There's no doubt in my mind. And so when we practice these things, we can become healthier. So sometimes, though, if you're struggling, it's hard to pray. And I just encourage you to pray even if you don't feel like it. And if you don't feel like it and you don't know what to pray, maybe choose a favorite prayer that you say over and over again, or choose a mantra like Holy Spirit be with me, or something that just helps you connect again with God. You may not feel the connection, but the practice, I believe, will help. Use movement. A lot of people think when you meditate, you sit cross-legged and put your hands on your legs and maybe chant or do om. But meditation can be movement too. There are things like prayer labyrinths you can walk through. You can even just take a walk in your neighborhood and just be very aware of where your feet are placed one at a time, and be very aware of your surroundings. As I said, I struggled with anxiety. One of the things with anxiety is it's very hard to sit still. It's very hard to calm your thoughts, right? What I used to do was I would turn off the lights in my office and close my eyes. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I would do that because it would force me to, when I walked around in my office, to slow down. I knew if I walked too fast, I was going to bump into something. And so it forced me to slow down. And so some people that I would meet with who are struggling with anxiety, I would kind of try to give them that clue. Yoga, Tai Chi, all of these are kind of meditative movements. So you do not have to be still when meditating. You just have to be aware and present. Going on to the next method. Memories. So some of you may have had those mountaintop moments with God. And those times are so special, but they don't come every day, right? But they speak to the character of God in your life. And so maybe it's a time when you're not experiencing that, or you're experiencing a low, to remember the high. Just trying to remember that high. Maybe God has come through for you in different scenarios. So maybe this time it feels like he's not, but he has in the past, God has in the past. And so leaning on that understanding of God, that God has come through in the past. And maybe you haven't experienced those things, but you've heard other people talk about them, or you've read a book about the miracles of God. You can use those as well to find your hope, your connection again. Remembering your favorite praise or worship song, or, it doesn't even have to be a praise and worship song. It can be, Cyndi Lauper, Time After Time, if that resonates with you, That shows my age a little bit, doesn't it? But anyway, it can be anything that resonates with you. Maybe you like classical music. Classical music calms me down. I grew up in a very snowy area of the country, and I would put classical music on when I had to drive in snowstorms, because it would calm me down. Music has a big impact on our mood, right? If you want energy, you put on something upbeat. You want to, maybe you want to cry and get it all out, so you put on a sad song. Whatever resonates with you, whatever helps. Once again, remember who you believe God to be. And then remember that mental illness is an illness. It is an illness. So if you're struggling with it, or someone else is struggling with it, try not to get to a space again where you think, oh, they're just not doing enough, or I'm not doing enough. It's an illness. It takes treatment. It takes time to overcome it. So the next one that I want to talk about is seeking treatment. When I first started to struggle, my family, they weren't big into psychiatric medication. And so I kind of had that in my head too. And so I took some medication when I first started struggling, and I just was like, nope, I'm good. I'll take it for as little amount of time as you tell me to, and then I'm done. And that's what I did. And then I kept having periods of time where I struggled with depression and anxiety. And so that's when I determined, maybe I really do need this to keep me even. Medication should help you feel more like yourself, not less like yourself. So if you're trying to find the right treatment, just think of that in your mind, that it should make you feel more of yourself, not less of yourself. And if it's not, then maybe seeking something else, some other kind of treatment then. new treatments arise all the time. There are people who are medication resistant. And so right now they're doing studies on psychedelics, medical setting, psychedelics, for depression. So they're constantly coming up with new ways of treating people. There's also one called transmagnetic stimulation, which is kind of using magnets to stimulate the brain in certain areas to help with things like depression. That's a fairly new one too. So maybe someone is struggling to find the right treatment and they're starting to lose hope. New things are coming out. Just remember that new things are coming out. And don't believe that seeking help, seeking treatment makes you, not trust God or makes you weak. As a matter of fact, I think that when we become vulnerable and admit we need help, that is one of the strongest moments in your life because you're making yourself vulnerable, right? You don't know how people will react. Hopefully you have some good trustworthy people in your life that you can speak to about it. But you're allowing yourself to be vulnerable. You're putting down the guard. That takes strength and takes courage to do that and to say, I need help. Once again, I wanted to reiterate the crisis number. It's 988. If you are struggling with something, and even if it's not an emergency, you can call them and they'll try to help you find the right place to get help. Accept feeling distant. This is the next connection. We all go through periods of our life where maybe God doesn't feel so close. And so that's normal. And when you're struggling with a mental illness, that also can impact it, right? And so we can't necessarily expect that the minute we get treatment, that connection's going to be there again. It might take some time. I mean, maybe it will. Maybe for some folks, there's that quick turnaround, right? But I would just encourage you to, if it doesn't happen, not to be discouraged, but to know that maybe it'll take a little bit of time. And many people go through what they call a dark night of the soul. And if you look at this quote I have up here, or this definition I have up here, the part of it that really stands out to me is that all sense of consolation is removed. So if God is your source of consolation and you're reaching out over and over again and you don't feel like he's there, that feels dark. But even the most faithful people have dark nights of the soul. Mother Teresa wrote about having dark nights of the soul. This woman full of faith and helping others, but she had some struggles on occasion. And even when you're not, feeling it, remember things like the Psalms and all the emotions that come with the Psalms, and how they lifted those up to God, how the writers of the Psalms lifted those up to God, and try to do the same yourself. God's big enough to handle anything. I remember times being extremely angry with God and kind of yelling out at him. So this is the last method that I want to talk about, is accepting help and hope from others. So Ryan talked a little bit about this last week too, about other people having hope for us. And something I used to say to some of the patients that I met with was, I know you do not have hope right now, but I do. I have hope for you. And so I'm going to hold that hope for you, and I hope you find it too. And it's true, I did. People would ask me, when I would see people return, how I didn't lose hope. Well, because they're there, they're still seeking treatment, there's still hope to get better. It's when you stop. It's when you stop trying that concerns me. If one person showed up 10 times in a year, and maybe it took that 10th time for them to, recover from addiction or to find the right treatment, so be it. If that's what it takes, that's what it takes. So try not to isolate, even if you're feeling like distant from folks. It's one thing to, if you're grieving. I know for me, I like some alone time if I'm grieving, just to kind of be alone with my thoughts. It's another thing to isolate on a longer basis and kind of distance yourself from your community or your family or your friends. So try not to do that. Maintain those relationships here that you might have, your faith communities and others, of course. Find a core group of people that you trust. Not everyone is trustworthy with our emotions. It's just a fact of life. So find the people that you know you can be open and honest with, and that you can share things with, and they will not be judgmental. They will be supportive. And then finally, ask for someone else to hope for you. As I said, people can hold hope for us, and I think that's a good thing. If they can find it, hopefully you can find it again sometime. And going on, that's the last of my methods of connection. So now is the time for questions. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Suicide means that someone gets so sad that they decide that they don't want to live anymore and they take their own life. It's a very sad, sad state to be in. Yes. Yes. The question was, do I have any book recommendations about faith and mental health? There is a book it's a Christian book based about the Bible and where in the Bible certain things are talked about. Unfortunately, I cannot remember the name of it at the moment, but I can always post it on the Well Facebook page when I get a chance. So the question was, when I said I walked around in the dark, was that a known way of meditating, or was it just something I did? It was just something I did. I decided I had to slow down and figured that would make me slow down. So no one taught me that. It just was something I was like, hey, I got to deal with this. How am I going to deal with it? And it helped me slow my body down so that my thoughts would slow down too. So, yes. So the question was about the setting I work in and who the people are that I most interact with. And then also if, since COVID, there are programs to help providers, nurses, providers, etc., dealing with the after effects of COVID. And so first, I'm not currently in a position where I see patients very often. That was prior to my current position. So my current position, I'm managing the chaplains who are going out to see patients. So I interact with them most, and then I also interact with more of the managerial staff and leaders trying to get programs in place, like the suicide prevention campaign, which I put into place partly because you're right, healthcare workers are particularly at risk for suicide. Part of that is because of their licensing and things like that, which they're trying to improve, but they're worried about seeking help because they're worried about licensure in their career and things like that. There are programs. One is called Healing of Memories. It's a retreat for healthcare workers that is completely free, put on by an outside organization that does this. They did this for veterans, and now they still do it for veterans, but now they're also doing it for healthcare workers. So there's that kind of thing. And, in most of our hospital settings now, we have benefits for counseling and things like that. The question is, that's something someone has to jump into. We also have peer support, and when there's a particularly difficult situation, we have what they call a critical incident stress management debrief for those people that were involved in that situation. So there are some things. Mm-hmm. Yes. The question was, is there a genetic predisposition for mental illnesses? And yes, they believe there is. Yes. And, like addiction, they very much believe there is a genetic component to that and what causes someone to have a more addictive trait than someone else within their personality. Mm-hmm. So the question is that, the stigma is lessening, which it is. We have a long way to go still, but it is lessening. What advice would I give to someone who grew up in maybe that stricter, rule-based kind of religious environment that didn't believe in psychiatric help? I would tell them to explore things like, if you had a medical illness, would you not take medication? If you have diabetes, you get treatment, ongoing treatment. If you have depression, maybe you need ongoing treatment. So I would encourage them to find the correlation between it and a physical ailment, and I would encourage them to focus on that God provides for us in different ways. This is one of the little things I used to tell people when they would say, I shouldn't have come in, I'm not trusting God. I would tell them, some of you may have heard this, it's kind of like a modern day parable where there's a flood and the neighbor comes to the guy and says, come on, we got to get out of here. And he goes, no, God will take care of me. And then the waters rise and a boat comes by and the people in the boat tell the guy, come on, we got to go, we got to get out of here. You're going to drown. And he says, no, God will take care of me. And then a helicopter, he's up on his roof because the water's gotten so high, and a helicopter comes by. And he says, no, I don't need your help, to the helicopter. I'm fine, God will help me. So the guy drowns. And he gets to heaven and he says, God, where were you? And God says, I sent your neighbor, I sent a boat, I sent a helicopter, right? So here you are. As I said, God works through people. So that is a little parable I would tell people when they were like, I shouldn't be here, I'm not trusting God. Maybe this is their helicopter, So I think you had a question? So the question was why, if someone comes in with suicidal ideation to the emergency department of a hospital, generally they are referred out because, emergency department doctors are trained for that type of intervention. So the idea is let's get them somewhere where they can have a specialized intervention for the mental illness. And so I think the answer is as far as changing things is a lot of hospitals are now looking at units to help stabilize someone and until they can get a bed, because we know there's a shortage of inpatient psychiatric beds, especially for adolescents, and residential treatments for adolescents is really low. But I'm not sure. I think the change should be in those connections, and maybe, I don't know of any extreme movements except for, like I said, I know of some places that are trying a unit connected to the ED to stabilize, staffed with people who are more specialized in mental health. It's not very prevalent yet, but it's being explored, and having units within hospitals that are both medical and psychiatric care. Some places have those. I think the biggest thing is the reason they're referred out is to get them the people that specialize in it. I really think that's the biggest reason. Maybe the answer is to have some of those specialist psychiatrists in the ED. Maybe that's the answer, I'm not sure. Having some nurses with psychiatric experience would probably be good too. Because it is one of those, in the medical setting, not everyone is trained very well to handle behavioral health patients. And are not comfortable with it sometimes. People go into specialties because they enjoy those specialties. So sometimes the specialists aren't there in the ED. But, all right. I think I'll close this in prayer now, and then I'll let Jackie do the final announcements, okay? All right. Dear God, thank you so much for this time, this opportunity. I pray that whatever people needed to hear today, whatever bit of information that could be helpful, I pray that the Holy Spirit led this to them, to their hearts and their minds. I pray, God, for continued work in the field of mental health, that more treatments would come, more people that are studying it and that want to help and that want to provide care would come along as well. God, I thank you for churches like The Well, where this is a focus, and that I'm allowed to speak and talk about these things. And so, God, I pray that each person in this room, that the Holy Spirit would guide and lead them in their body, mind, and spiritual health. Thank you, God, for all you've given us and what's yet to come. Amen.